overall, the majority of the class did really well on that test, and you keep up the hard work. Okay. All right, so let me fast forward to where we need to be at. Y'all want to go over to cell stuff some more? All right. All right, so we get to the nervous system. And the nervous system, give me some things that the nervous system does. What's it responsible for? Sending messages, good. What else? It also has to do with us maintaining our alertness, being awake, memory. Yeah, sending messages. Sending messages is an example of how typically you get a sensory end, such as if I touch something that's hot, and it quickly tells my brain, those would go to my brain, and then it works on my muscles, and it tells me to move, right? So you get a reaction from the input that it's getting. I'm going to go over, I'll come back to this real quick, because this is probably the only slide they're going to have of that. But it works, the nervous system really has somewhat of control of just about almost all the other systems as well. But the parts of it are divided into, as we know, the central nervous system, which is dealing with the brain and spinal cord, and then everything else is considered the peripheral nervous system, okay? All right, a neuron is what the term is for a nerve cell. So that's just what nerve cells are called. All right, they have a body. I'm going to go back to that dendrites and axons. So I'm going to go back now to here. So while these different nerve cells may look a little differently, but for the most part, they all, depending on what type of nerve cell they all have the body, which is here, which is also called the soma. And as you see, it does contain a nucleus. And it has dendrites, which are more or less, these are the sensories, these are the feelers. These are where they're going to interchange with adjacent nerve cells, okay, on the receiving end. And I'll go over this more in depth. So dendrites are these appendages that stick out here that interact with this. This is another nerve cell up here is what it's doing with. This is an axon. This is its nerve's axon. So the axon is more or less like this tail that comes off. And then, so your part you're seeing down here at the bottom is this from an adjacent nerve cell up here. I'm going to go to the board for a second. So y'all got this down so far? The central nervous system, the components structurally are the brain and the spinal cord, what makes it the central nervous system. All right, so this is another cell that's up here, and then there'd be, for these things to interact, here's another nerve cell. So make sure y'all get what I'm orchestrating, I'm showing right here. All right. So when nerve cells are just like any other cell, and we talked about, just real quick, we talked about the action potential. So the action potential is the ability for them, they are polarized, right? They become polarized, and then they're going to take and exchange things across the cell wall, which will affect other cells. Now, what happens with these cells, they're not connected, okay? This area between the two is actually called the synapse. When this cell here becomes where it depolarizes, it releases energy, right? That's what depolarization means. Don't worry, I'm not trying to get back on something you're confused about. But what it does down here, when it stimulates this doesn't actually touch this, and we don't actually have a movement of electrons in between there. What we have is the release of a chemical I'm going to call it a chemical substance right now. That more or less works as a transmitter. It's a chemical neurotransmitter is what it is. So the end of these become energized. It releases a chemical which goes down and stimulates this cell now to polarize. So it goes down, the same thing here, releases a chemical substance that affects the next adjacent cells. So these become polarized internally. It stimulates the buds on the end to release a chemical substance known as a neurotransmitter, a chemical neurotransmitter. It's a message. Overall, remember I talked about the message. I'm going down, I'm touching something, either it pokes me, it burns me, whatever. This is a basic example. This movement of this message going towards my brain and spinal cord is called afferent nerves. Afferent nerves carry messages to the brain and spinal cord. I'm going to put I'll just put brain and spinal. I was going to put central nervous system. All right, these afferent nerves are also known as, since it's carrying something to there, it's called sensory nerves. So this whole thing is going back towards this message here. It has a stimulus. It got poked, it got burnt, something smelled funny, whatever it needed to do to get a reaction. And so afferent is going to the brain and spinal cord. At that point, the brain quickly processes it, or spinal cord quickly processes it, and says, okay, now we're going to have to go and we're going to send another message for the reaction. These next nerves that go down that pathway are efferent. These go away from brain, and I'm just going to abbreviate spinal cord. These are also known as motor nerves. One way to remember that is you have to have senses before you can have a response, right? So an A comes before E. So the sensory comes before the motor movement, right? Whatever you're going to do, you got to have a message telling you to do something quick. So that's why we do that. Now, what these nerves then would do when they come down, it's not actually your nerves that's making you move your arm. It's what system? Muscle system. So what happens when this is, y'all, I'm just going to explain this, so just grasp it the best you can, okay? This goes down, and then let's say here, I got a muscle here. So what happens with this, I have to work on muscle cells now, right? So if I have a muscle cell, I need to stimulate that to polarize, right? Or to depolarize. So what happens is, on the cell here, different places, it has receptors. And there are receptors for this chemical that affects these and makes it depolarize. And what happens is, it's got a sensory message coming in, and it's going to react and depolarize, and then it's going to affect other ones. The way this works is, more or less, it allows, for muscle cells, it allows an influx of calcium to come into them, which is going, then that's going to start the adjacent cells to all do the same thing, to all depolarize and get the response you want to. That's big. I'm going deep. I just want to briefly describe that. So you see how that nerve cells, these work by doing this and releasing a chemical substance known as a neurotransmitter, and then we get down to the end, we're still not connected to the muscle cells, right? So they discharge that same neurotransmitter, that substance, which makes the muscle cells depolarize, and all that works off a strong influx and chain of calcium. So. Spinal cord. All right, so you got your whole cells right here. The dendrites receive the message from an adjacent cell. The axon down here in the buzz release that to affect another cell that's adjacent to it. Remember, there's two different string of nerves. I'm going to have a string of afferent nerves and then I guess I should have drawn that the other way. Hold on a second. Tracer. Now, the reason I drew that is because I don't want you to think that this cell right here, in other words, it doesn't, this string of nerve cells that are together, it doesn't reverse the process and go back through this way. Does that make sense? That's why you have two different chains going out for every single sensory, a bunch of them. You have a bunch of afferent nerves that go to certain muscles, and then you have a bunch of efferent nerves that go to from the same muscles. Does that make sense? That's just supposed to be S/C for spinal cord again. Now this is both of them. They're going to do the same thing towards the brain and the spinal cord. Now the reason, go ahead.
And you said the dendrites receive the message, and then the axon does what?
Delivers it. The axon is this tail that goes down, and then these little buds that are at the end, or when we get down here and this is stimulated, it stimulates it to release the chemical neurotransmitter that I'll go a little bit further in depth with. So basically what I want you to know right here are the different types of nerves. And then the passageway, how they go, they come from the different parts, comes into dendrites, through the axon, out through the buds in the end, through a neurotransmitter and a chemical substance that's known as a neurotransmitter. And this is the pathway to where you have nerves that go away from the brain and spinal cord and nerves that go to the brain and spinal cord. Clear on this? Yeah, I'm going to talk about those in just a second. Yeah, it is. That's what these are neurotransmitters. They're a chemical substance that transmits messages, okay? Neurological, neurons, cells, nerve cells, and the transmitter is how it transmits the message. It carries the message. You know, I just remembered I got those new markers in there. I need to break them out and see if they work any better. Or some of these. Does that make sense to everybody? I should have taken a picture of that, but it's all right. We got it on. Can you got the board? You got the board good there, LT, phone boy? And were you able to? It hasn't cut off, has it?
No, it's only 17 minutes.
All right, keep an eye. It's going to go in a second. Unless somebody figured out, and I don't know about how to shut that off of there, but when we first got that camera years ago, I was like, something ain't right. And I looked it up and it said you couldn't shut it off, that part off. I don't know why it does that. Okay. Grab another marker. This chapter actually, and basically what the nervous system and the endocrine system, they pretty much control everything in our body. The movement, how fast things go, whereas more the endocrine system, and it's a more or less the endocrine system, they call it a ductless, meaning it's not connected, and it actually works off different chemicals or hormones that are released from certain glands that get a response from other organs. And that's kind of what, when you don't have nerves that are the way that they kind of have that gap, that synapse in between them, it's kind of doing the same thing a little bit, right? But your nerves, even though they are not really touching each other, the nerves that go down and run are all pretty much chained, and in essence they do touch, but they touch each other by this neurotransmitter, the chemical. Make sense? This fills that gap in. All right, so we talked about neuron. We talked about neurotransmitters working on target tissue such as our muscles. All right, so this chart to me, I wish they would have put this up at the beginning of it, but breaking down the different parts of the nervous system, this is in your book. So again, you have your central one, which is of course your brain and spinal cord, and then everything else is called the peripheral. That peripheral meaning the outside of the brain and spinal cord makes up your peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is further broken down into the autonomic, which carries out things on its own. Autonomic, things we don't have to think about. We don't have to tell our heart to beat, okay? Because it's going on by itself, right? Kind of like voluntary, involuntary, I mean. Then you have the somatic, which is voluntary, which also, when you hear that of somatic, think of muscles, skeletal muscles, I move them. So somatic is voluntary, and it involves the skeletal muscles. So to further go back, when we talked about, going back to our muscle types from last week, And you got cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. The skeletal goes with the somatic and voluntary, right? And then your cardiac and smooth muscles that we don't control are going to be over in the autonomic. All right, the autonomic nervous system is further divided down into what's termed the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. The parasympathetic is responsible for our daily measures that we do. Keeps everything in an even keel. It's what maintains our body's homeostasis. And it kind of puts in check the sympathetic nervous system, because the sympathetic nervous system works towards a response. It's like, they call it an alert system. We call that the fight or flight. Put a note next to that. It's a fight or flight because it gets stimulated. When you get scared, what do? You react to it, right? Boo, you scared. And you're not, but what happens then is you don't just jump. What happens is your pulse goes up, your respiratory rate goes up, your blood pressure may go up a little bit. That's the response you get. The parasympathetic's job is to slow everything back down, homeostasis, and get you back to a normal level. Another term where the sympathetic is fight or flight, the parasympathetic can also be known as the feed and breed.
Feed and breathe.
Feed and breed. This is more or less what we just went over a while ago, we wrote down on the slide. All right. Let me look at something real quick, because I'm not real familiar with this. I say put what I put in. All right. All right, we'll revisit that stuff in a second. All right, so the brain. The main part of the brain, from back here you see like this shelf ledge, all of this right here is referred to as the cerebrum. The cerebrum is broken down into different divisions. All right, if you're looking at it, and I had a brain out, I have a brain diagram at the office, but I don't have one here, except for this one, which really doesn't help me none. All right, so I'm gonna go more over the feed and breed and all that in just a minute when I get that part towards the end, the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so it's divided into different areas, and kind of it goes hand in hand with what? Why do we go over already? We see a lot of the same stuff on frontal, parietal, occipital, yeah, bones. So the frontal is the main part from about the middle line. They call that a central fissure, which if you're looking at a brain that's out, you'll see like this cavity that starts to go across. Fissure is almost like where it's joined together. And the part that's on the side, just like the bones, is the parietal. You have your temporal area, and then this is your occipital, is the back. If you take your hand, you go down here where your head starts to curve under, right where it starts to curve right there, that's pretty much is the end of where the cerebrum underneath the skull would be. That is your occipital area. Down below it here, what lies back up in there, is your cerebellum. Your cerebellum is what's also termed, several terms actually. I've heard it called the hindbrain, heard it called the small brain. It's mainly what its job is though. It deals with balance and coordination. All right, so make a note. Here's what your actual different lobes are pretty much do. Your frontal lobe deals with gathering information. It's where memory's at. It's where decision making takes place at. It's also where your muscle movement is generated, where the brain receives it and says move. That's where movement would be at in there. And the ability to speak comes from there as well. Your parietal area is mainly sensory. That's where it would be more of the, all of the afferent nerves coming back to the brain to where the sensory recognition can be taking place. Your temporal lobe here is dealing with your hearing primarily. And your occipital area is where your vision. That's why somebody hits you in the back of the head, or you get hit back in the head with a ball or a baseball bat. What do you see? Stars, because your vision is getting messed up. All right, so after those parts we talked about, after that, we have what makes up the brain stem, which there's another slide that shows that better. Don't worry about that right here. But you have your medulla oblongata, and then your pons. The pons, if you want to make a little note to that, that's kind of the structure that pretty much connects, not structurally, but you know, kind of like the messages and centers, because it goes from there, it's going to go down to your spinal cord. The brain stem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. It kind of just unites all of those. And then, of course, extending from the bottom of that would be where your spinal cord is. And going back, trivia question from back in the skeletal system. The spinal cord extends through the base of the skull through an opening. What is that opening called? Foramen magnum. Good, good. All right, I think we're all pretty good about the brain being the central organ of the nervous system, right? Weighs about 3 pounds, sits in the skull, totally encapsulated except for where it extends. The spinal cord has an opening where it extends, or the skull has an opening where the spinal cord will extend down through it, which is important as we move forward with like brain injuries and stuff. When people start having swelling in their brain, what happens if you get too much pressure in there? Then you do what's called herniate, and what's happening is you get so much pressure, it's trying to force your brain and everything through the foramen magnum. And that causes some issues that we'll talk about as we go through this. All right, so inside the cranium, we have cerebrospinal fluid that helps cushion the brain, and also it bathes it, and also bathes the spinal cord as well. The protective layers underneath the skull, I ain't got a good picture of that in here. All right, I'm sorry. Y'all look in your book on page, whatever it's on, where they have this right here. All right, so this is kind of flip-flopped here. So the pia mater, I'll go in reverse order. So the pia mater is the layers. You have 3 layers of protection. And the pia mater is the part that actually touches the brain. So it's the most inner layer of these protective layers. This is the skull. Let me just write it up here because I think it'll be better y'all see this. I'm just going to draw it as a dang circle. Now this would be the skull. This is my brain, which so the skull is relatively thick, okay? So this layers here, the protective layers, are between the skull and the actual brain. The innermost layer that touches the brain is what's known as the pia mater. I could have went and got some more colors, but I hope y'all can get the gist of this here. The middle layer of the protective covering is going to be the arachnoid. And the outermost, the thickest, it's almost like a rubber type or leather type substance or layer, material it's made out of, is going to be the dura mater. So I'm going to put some notes right here. Pia mater. Touches brain. The arachnoid. It's like a spider web. Hence the word arach. And then dura mater. It actually is composed of like an inner and outer layers as well, but don't worry about that. And it's like a leather covering, toughest covering of the three. Together, all of this right here are known as the meninges. What are the meninges? The protective covering of the brain. So, just as real in the field or things that you can relate to, when these get an infection, they become inflamed. Hence, meningitis. Comes from a virus. So the arachnoid is like this, looks like a big spider web that covers the brain. Okay? Everybody got that? Key words to know when you're asked about them. Pia mater is the thinnest. It actually touches the urethra, and then touches the brain. And then, of course, in there too also is cerebral spinal fluid that just helps fill up the space. There's not a whole lot of room in there. Your brain doesn't have no room to move. But that's why when sudden, stopping or falling and hitting your head, it actually can cause injury on the side that it hits, but also a little bit of movement causes injury on the other side. When we get the head injuries, we'll learn more about that. It's called coup contra coup. All right, we went over about the cerebrum is. I broke down all those different parts a while ago. That pretty much encompasses what the cerebrum does. Your thalamus is kind of, again, this says it goes to work in coordination, as it says there. It's an area, let's see if there's another picture. I'm going to be upset if there's not. Wow. That's why I don't like these slides. Some of them are good. All right, so with me, look on page. There we go. 8-45. That way you can kind of see the area of the brain we're talking about. All right, the thalamus and the hypothalamus make up that area. Is more or less what's called the diencephalon. Just another term, just an area of the brain, and those two structures make it up. This is where they're getting messages, and they're starting to send this back down through towards the spinal cord, also down towards the pituitary gland, which when we get to endocrine, you'll learn that that's actually the master gland. It controls all other glands in the body. No, the pituitary gland is. We'll talk more about that when we get to the endocrine. But in the structure, you can see on page 187, since I didn't put one up in here, you can actually see where it sits at in relationship. And see how the thalamus and then the hypothalamus, which is hypo means what? Below the thalamus, is this is part of that structure that extends down through there. All right, below that is where you actually have the development of your brainstem. It's terrible. Can you guys over here see this okay when I write right here? All right, the brain stem is the structure at the bottom of the brain, and it's made up of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. The brain stem has 3 different functions. It has a cardiac function, vascular function, and respiratory function. The one we mostly think about is what? Your medulla oblongata. And the mainly respiratory, because we think about, we get an injury up here, we quit breathing, okay? And that's where the phrenic nerve innervates and goes out and tells the diaphragm to move. But actually, the cardiac function and vascular functions, on a side note, those will be the things that are stimulated, these nerves that come out of there, which go like to the heart and tells it, hey, pick the rate up. And slow it down through a nerve slow it down through the vagus nerve that comes out through there. And then vascular function, that's part of the brain that tells our vessels to dilate or constrict based off the pressure readings that is being sent to it through the nervous system. So nerves that come from these distant sensors in the body, and then it goes to the brain, says, hey, we're sensing low pressure. Okay, now goes down through part of this, our brain stem, one of these functions that works on them. Does that make sense? Of course, you have a lot of peripheral nerves and all that coming down through here as well. These are things up here. I'll get to it and I'm going to show you on here in a second. They actually come from cranial nerves, which are just really important nerves that extend directly from the brain and don't come from the spinal cord itself. Are we clear on that? Yes.
Does the midbrain control the cardiac function and pons vascular function and medulla respiratory function, or does all 3 of those just controlled by the brain stem?
Yeah, this is actually just a part of it, the midbrain, mid between the brain,
Okay.
I mean between the cerebellum and that, and between the brain stem. So like the brain and the brain stem, you have a part of it there called the midbrain. It's pretty much that all those things are different parts of the brain stem that are composed of. I didn't mean to give you that type of. That doesn't go. No, here, let me do this. That's two different columns. Thank you. Yeah. Everybody clear on that? They don't go hand in hand with each other. All right. In your book, I want you to make a note on this. On page 188. I want you to circle cranial nerve number 3. For us to be alert, the minimum that we have to have is one hemisphere working good, one side hemisphere is left and right. Okay, our brain, if we split it right down the middle, when I say hemi, is half, hemisphere. I need to have one hemisphere that's in good working order, and my reticular activating system needs to be in function. But this is really involved with sleep and wake and all and so forth. All right, so this is just a picture outlining what the spinal cord looks like and how the nerves take and innervate or extend from that. It has arteries and veins and capillaries. It's tissue. It's got to be fed just like every other organ and every other tissue in our body. The layers that are associated with it are the exact same as the brain has. So beneath your vertebrae, you have a dura mater layer on the outermost, the arachnoid in the middle, and of course then the pia mater that actually touches the actual tissue of the spinal cord. Somebody need that still? What y'all need on this? Back one? Oh, okay, yeah. Mainly on the RES, works on the brain, and it deals with our consciousness and sleep and awake cycles is basically what I want you to remember about that. Good? I'll leave it right there because we'll go ahead and it's about 10 after, so we'll go ahead and take a break. Be back at 20 after. Make sure you can hear me. Let me back up. Let me just back up real quick because I forgot. Doesn't have the microphone on. Pretty much all I mentioned that the spinal cord extends out through the foramen magnum and extends down through inside our vertebral bodies, or the vertebrae. It's protected. It extends down and then stops around the level of L2, the lumbar 2 vertebrae. And then from there, just long strands of nerves extend from there, major nerves, to the lower part of the body. And I mentioned that one of the most common ones you probably heard of is the sciatic nerve, which are left and right sciatic nerves that run through each one of the glutes. And extends down to the bottom of the legs. All right, so back on this, I said more or less we've already discussed this early on in the lecture. And I got to the part here we mentioned that another term is the sympathetic is still the fight or flight, but this text likes to call it the rest or digest for the parasympathetic. And these two systems, more or less, you have a response such as a stressor, fear, an injury, trauma, and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, okay? I'm going to go over on the board in a minute and talk about what symptoms or signs that you may see from the patient, or what happens with our body when we undergo a sympathetic response. The parasympathetic does the opposite. It is involved with our normal digestive functions. It's also going to take, when we speed things up, and it's going to slow things back down to get us back to our normal heart rate and our normal skin, our normal pupils, and so forth. So these two systems kind of counter one another to maintain that state of homeostasis. All right, remember what? Let's go back and review a second. We have a nerve cell called a neuron. There's two parts, or there's actually three main parts to it. You have the dendrites, which receive messages in from adjacent cells. You have the cell body or soma that contains the nucleus. And then below that you have the axon, which is like a chain that extends the inferior portion or the distal end of it, the cell. It goes down to other little tentacles, we actually call them buttons on the end. And from there, for cells, adjacent cells, to communicate, what is that substance called? A neurotransmitter. Good. So the neurotransmitter is like a chemical that's released. When our nerve cells depolarize, they stimulate the release of a neurotransmitter, and that crosses that gap. What's that gap called between the two cells? The synapse. And it floats over, extends over, and then it affects the next cell to start the process of depolarization, or to sends a message, right? Relays messages.
My question is, between the dendrites and the axon, you said something was between there?
The dendrite
Yes, sir.
and the axon, you have the main cell body.
Okay.
Another name for that is the soma, and that's where the nucleus is at. All right, so two different systems, right? Sympathetic and the parasympathetic, which are branches off of what part of the nervous system? Yeah, autonomic. All right, so we talked about that at the end and between those cells to crosses that synapse is a neurotransmitter, a chemical substance that's released from the cell. The primary neurotransmitter on the sympathetic side is epinephrine slash norepinephrine. There's basically just two different chemical structures. They both pretty much do the same thing. The primary neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic nervous system is a substance called acetylcholine. Or ACH. The response that you get from here, this is just some basically vocabulary stuff for now, type of response from a sympathetic response from the release of the epinephrine and norepinephrine is also termed an adrenergic response. The reason it's called an adrenergic response is because it comes, when this is stimulated, just real quick, I want y'all to follow me. Y'all quit writing for a second, and I'll let you do that in a minute. Remember, because this just kind of ties some things in what I'm about to say. Remember how I talked about going into the next section when we go into Mars, the endocrine system, right? Okay, so what happens when you get this response is something's happened in the body. I mean, something's happened to create this stressor. For example, I burn myself. I get scared. I have some kind of trauma to my leg. Whatever happens. The sympathetic, I activate my sympathetic nervous system, okay? Because of sensory, which are what? Those nerve cells are going towards my brain to tell I need to do something. So they're afferent nerves, right? So they go, I'm generating my response. The response goes, okay, this is sympathetic fight or flight. I need to activate all the organs that involve the fight or flight system. So my brain, it goes from my brain down into just below my diencephalon, right? My hypothalamus. Below that was, what was that master gland I told you? Okay, so it activates the pituitary gland and says, okay, it's going to excrete, got me? Pituitary glands in the brain. And it is going to excrete something y'all heard of the other day, adrenochronotropic hormone. Adrenochronotropic hormone. What that is a chemical that's fed through the body, circulatory system, and it goes to my kidneys, or the top of my adrenal glands. On those adrenal gland, the cells, I know y'all hate to go there, but here we go for a second. They have receptors on them. One type of receptor is, guess what it is? It's adrenochronotropic hormone receptor, or an adrenergic receptor, and it tells your adrenal glands at rest, these are my kidneys, it rests on top, the adrenals rest on top of the kidneys, and tells it to release. What's it going to release? It's a neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, okay? It's in the bloodstream. Now it goes and it gets the reaction from all the other organs that it needs to. Or it's sending that message, is my pituitary gland, is it connected to a channel all the way to my adrenal glands? No, it's ductless. So we excrete hormones, a chemical, into the blood. The brain told it to. It travels through our blood, and it's in the plasma, and then it's got a high concentration than normal because I've excreted this adrenochronotropic hormone in there, right? So I got a high concentration. I get down to my adrenal gland cells. They got a low concentration, so it's going to diffuse into there. And I'm attracted to it because I have a receptor for it. And it causes those adrenals to release epi and norepinephrine. Make sense? Trying to tie all that stuff together. Now, the acetylcholine is basically the same thing on the parasympathetic nervous system. So it doesn't do the same thing. It does the opposite of what epinephrine does. It's going to get it, and I'm going to show you what these reactions are in a second. Now, acetylcholine is actually generated inside the nerve cells itself. There's actually an enzyme in there, acetyl, I can't remember the exact term of it, but it takes that when it's stimulated, when it gets the receptor that says release and generate acetylcholine, has a receptor it tells it to, it produces more, and it's where it releases it into the bloodstream. When it's released into the bloodstream from the nerve cells, then it stimulates all the organs just like the epi and norepinephrine to do whatever it's supposed to do to get the opposite effect. These type of response is termed a cholinergic. Why does it get cholinergic? From acetylcholine. So we get a cholinergic type of response. We have an adrenergic type of response. So what is that response? What's going to happen? Sympathetic. Let's say we get a stimulated. Example. Scared. This isn't a good example, but that's what we're going to use. All right, my heart rate. Go up. It's going to cause my skin to become diaphoretic. Diaphoretic means sweaty. My pupils, they get enlarged, and say, I'm going to change that to dilated. Dilated means they get bigger. All right, the opposite of this, now the parasympathetic, this is just some examples. I'll tell y'all a few more in a second. I'm running out of room to write. So the opposite of this is now, when this happens, my body wants to get itself back in check, right? So it's responsible for bringing the heart rate back down. It's going to dry it, make the skin so I have I can just put less. I'll put dry. I'm just going to put dry up skin. And then pupils, it'll constrict the pupils. This right here, I'm going to have less gastric secretions. This one I'll have increased gastric secretions. I'm going to actually try to find and print y'all out some. I don't know why they don't have this in this book, because this is more kind of an advanced level thing. It's in the basic of the EMT book, but not this one. Make sure I don't forget nothing that's really important. Oh yeah. Another thing on this side over here, your vessels constrict. So the vessels, the smooth muscles constrict or contract and they constrict down, and here the vessels dilate. Saliva decrease, saliva increase. These are just some things that happen when each one of these systems are activated. It talks about it a little bit in your book, but it doesn't provide examples, okay? I'm not going to really test you on this, but if y'all look around on page 190, that diagram right there where the spinal nerves are at, that just so you can reference like where the nerves actually innervate, which means where they extend out from the spinal cord, the nerves go down and affect different areas of the body, okay? For reference, normally T4 is about the nipple line as you look on there to where they innervate and go out. All right. Any questions over this? Was that too confusing? Things I want to make sure you know. The parts of the nerve cell. I want you to know that they actually are not connected, but in between them, there's an area called the synapse where we have to communicate with a neurotransmitter, a chemical that's released from the cell, which again affects the adjacent cells. And I want you to understand the different parts of the nervous system, starting with your nervous system. On the chart that shows you then, we have the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. Everything else besides the brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. In our peripheral nervous system, we have the autonomic and the somatic or voluntary, all right? We have different types of nerves. We have nerves that go away. Let me back up. We have nerves that go away from the brain and spinal cord called efferent. And then the ones that go towards the brain and spinal cord are afferent. Afferent are termed sensory nerves. A sense has to happen before we can get a response, right? So sensory afferent comes before efferent. And efferent is motor. That's correct. Motor nerves. And the parasympathetic and sympathetic are divisions of the autonomic nervous system. These are the ones that I don't have to consciously think of for it to do. The body does it by itself. These divisions of sympathetic are also known as a fight or flight, which is going to act to a stressor or a trauma or something with the body to create a response. The parasympathetic not only takes care of our daily activities and digestion, it also helps to balance and put everything back to a normal state after you have that response. Okay? Some examples of those are listed on the board. The primary neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system is epinephrine/norepinephrine. These are stimulated and released by the adrenal glands, which rest on top of the kidneys, and they are also given the term, due to that, adrenergic responses. And the primary neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine. And since the last of it's colon, it's also termed as a cholinergic response. Just some terminology to help, because you may see this, and I'll start referring to stuff as an adrenergic response and a cholinergic response as we get on with the class. All right, so one thing in practice, one thing in the field, you may, sometimes what we do, just to kind of put this into play here. I'm at the hospital, I'm about to have surgery. Do you think that's a stressor? Hell yeah, it is. So one thing they do when they put you to sleep is they either intubate you, which they direct tube into your lungs, or they use a supraglottic airway that goes down past your gag reflex to help keep your tongue from blocking your airway. Well, if I'm about to be put to sleep and I'm about to be concerned with my airway flat on my back, but now my body is doing this to try to calm down my decrease. My mouth's drying up, it's going to start producing more, right? I don't want it to produce anymore. So what they will do is they will give me a small amount of a drug called atropine. What atropine is classified as a parasympatholytic. A lytic is one that blocks the receptors of the other. It blocks the receptors of this to prevent increased saliva. So it dries up my oral secretions. You can also call it a what? A sympathomimetic because it mimics this. So I want it to dry my mouth up. The stuff that you're going to hear throughout the course, it's like a prelude going down. There are nerve agents. Military guys in here, you've heard of nerve agents, right? You wear train on wearing gas masks. We know that there are sick people in this world that want to hurt us, right? Well, one thing that they do is they'll take and put nerve agents into a gas and try to distribute it in the air to have people breathe and makes them sick. So those different nerve agents cause certain things. Another thing that they do is it's real similar to a pesticide, which is known as organophosphates. Okay, they put them in and try to in gases as a weapon, but it's also things that people spray. That's why they have to have a certain license to spray those chemicals that kill insects. It's because they're dangerous to work with. Well, if we get too much and breathe in too much organophosphate, or we get it in our skin too much, then what it does is it exaggerates the response of the parasympathetic nervous system. And what that does, it creates what's known as a sludge effect. And what we get is we more or less start leaking out of all of our orifices. We have increased drooling. Our eyes are watering. S is for saliva, S is for lacrimation. Our eyes are watering. We have frequent urination for you. We have frequent defecation for taking a dump. And we have emesis, so everything just pouring out of us. Puking, crapping, eyes are watering. I want to reverse those effects. I've got exaggerated parasympathetic response, so once again, I want to block this, and I give atropine for that. A lot of it to help block that. So, military guys, did y'all have Mark I kits? Yeah. The 2-PAM chloride and the atropine sulfate. That you have an auto injector, and if they're exposed to it, you shoot yourself like an EpiPen in the leg. Yeah. After 9/11, every first responder in the country was issued a Mark I kit. And it wasn't too long ago we finally said they're expired, we need to take them up. They now make one that's a replacement for that. We're not required to use those or carry those. And the reason is what? The threat has changed. It's not so much about chemical warfare. What is it now? Guns, cars, buses, active shooter is like the biggest threat that we're preparing for right now. Until somebody releases some sarin in the Tokyo subway again, then we'll go back to, okay, Here's your Mark 1 kits again. All right, any questions over that? Was that painful? Soak it in, read it, go back and look over the questions that dealt with the nervous system. And that'll be it for today. Is everybody done with